Now that we've discussed LDAP add, let's look at LDAP delete as a means for removing objects from our directory information tree. So as we know, we've added various objects to the tree. Each OU contains 5 users, and we can use LDAP delete to delete any of or all of the users and or organizational units at will. This subsection will be labeled LDAP delete, and it features a means to remove DIT objects, or directory information objects. The usage is similar to LDAP add in that you specify LDAP delete instead of LDAP add, followed by the key bind dn, which we'll copy from here. It's the same root dn until we add other users and update the ACLs. Uppercase W to prompt us for a password, an optional host depending on where we run it from. Verbosity -v works with add, modify, delete, as well as all the other LDAP add, LDAP related commands. Will echo to standard out to the shell what has been deleted or if any errors were experienced. And there's even an option to simulate the actions -n, which we'll look at momentarily. Now, following all of this, you may optionally specify the objects to delete on standard in, or indicate the object in between quotes, or specify a file using the -f option, which references the object or objects to delete. Let's begin with the first option, which is to delete a single distinguished name using the syntax. So supposing we wanted to remove the user Linux CBT 5 from the sales OU. Let's see how we'd construct that. In dn to delete, we specify the distinguished name of the user Linux CBT 5 in the given OU. Now, how do we find the dn? Well, as opposed to guessing it, we could use LDAP search. That's one method. Here we have LDAP search searching against the primary server, and the last user is Linux CBT 5. The dn is one of the attributes returned by LDAP search. So simply extract the dn and delete the user based on the dn. Let's give this a try. Linux CBT 5's dn is cn equals Linux CBT, OU equals sales, and DC equals Linux CBT, DC equals internal. We'll paste this at shell. It'll prompt us to authenticate. Notice in the output we see LDAP initialize, which means that the verbose option reflects the fact that we have initialized a connection to Linux CBT SUSE 2 using the URL or the URI LDAP:// hostname. Let's try to authenticate, and we omitted the -x option. That was a small problem, which is why we got the SASL error. And now we see that the entry has been deleted. Deleting entry, cn equals so on and so forth. The exit status is 0. Let's just tack on that -x option. And then we'll confirm whether or not the object has truly been deleted by using LDAP search, where we see the final user in the sales OU is Linux CBT 4 as opposed to 5, and the number of entries has been reduced to 18 from 19, and our graphical browser, if reloaded, should reflect as such. Sales contains only 4 users, whereas engineering and people contain 5 users. So the key to deleting is to specify one or more distinguished names. Let's just note, delete using the dn of an object Not necessarily a user or group or OU, but any directory information tree or LDAP object. So our initial task was to delete an object from the command line, and we did so. But obviously you'll want to be able to delete wholesale, not necessarily one at a time. It's good to know how to do it one at a time, but what about wholesale? So the next task, delete objects wholesale from OU equals sales, DC equals Linux CBT, DC equals internal. So for this we should construct a text file to specify either on standard in or as a script. Let's begin by using standard in. So we'll indicate via stdin. So we need to indicate the DNs that are a part of the sales organizational unit. We can extract it from this particular file, or we can construct it all together from scratch. Now this file contains everyone in sales, so let's just work with this. We've already gotten rid of 5. So we'll remove all but the DNs of 4, 3, 2, and 1. Now in fact, since the usernames are close to identical, we'll take this one CN string and just modify it for the users 1 through 4. Changing this to 3, this to 2, and this to 1. This will be users to delete. Again, we're going to specify this on the command line. We'll rerun our command, and instead of indicating the DN to delete, we'll omit it. Now if you omit it, you'll see what happens momentarily. Let's get rid of that distinct item and see what happens. It prompts us for password. Then LDAP delete waits as expected for the distinguished names to be removed. So we'll Control-Shift-V, which pastes the items, and notice one at a time they've been deleted from the DIT. Control-D will indicate that we're finished, and an echo of the exit status should return 0 if the items were deleted successfully. Now let's try it again after the objects have been deleted to see the behavior of LDAP delete. Again, we'll authenticate. We'll paste the items, and notice on the attempt to delete the first item, Linux CBT1, LDAP delete returns no such object. Not no such user, simply no such object, because an object can be a user, group, or any piece of information that matches the schema or schemas in question. So the items were not deleted because they don't exist. Before we clear screen, let's echo the exit status. It's clean because as far as it's concerned, there's nothing to do. Now let's return to the LDAP browser and reload to see what exists in the sales OU. It is now empty. Engineering and people still have items. Which leads us to the next thing. How about deleting the OU? Well, let's take a twist on what we've done. We'll add the OU to the end of this dump. OU equals sales. And we can just take this from here. This will do. In fact, LDAP search shows you the exact syntax for specifying the DN of an object, whether organizational unit or user or group or otherwise. So for the sales OU, let's find the various organizational units. They're dumped above, and here we see people, engineering, sales. The sales OU's DN is simply OU equals sales, DC equals Linux CBT, DC equals internal. So we have that straight. Now how about trying to delete wholesale these items that don't exist, followed by an item that does exist? So let's just update our notes to reflect what we're attempting to do here. delete non-existing and existing items. So the syntax is the same, but let's see how LDAP delete behaves. Clear screen. LDAP delete, we'll find it in our history. It prompts us to authenticate, where we'll paste the items to be deleted. So the user Linux CBT1 was not found, so therefore LDAP delete was unable to delete that object. What does that mean? What does that translate to? Well, let's take a look at LDAP search to see whether or not it has removed the organizational unit sales as a consequence. And you'll then learn the default behavior of the LDAP delete utility. And the same goes for LDAP add and modify. Notice that the sales OU still exists. So let's record some observations. Default behavior of LDAP online tools is to abort if, or abort at the step that fails, which means since the first step failed, which was to delete a non-existing object, none of the remaining steps were performed. Now we did mention that there's a workaround. From the shell, if you execute LDAP delete or any of the LDAP commands, help, you'll see many options return to the shell. What we're looking for is the continuous operation, which is -C, and when we scroll up we find it. Continuous operation mode does not stop for errors. So that is our workaround, because again, in a situation where you're attempting to apply large-scale changes, you're bound to have errors in all likelihood. So what you want is a means for applying the good objects or applying the good changes, and a means for filtering or having a filtration system for the objects that were not committed. So let's copy this. And we'll append -C. And we'll just note -C option continues even if errors are encountered. With that said, let's try to re-execute the changes that we attempted to commit to the directory by re-executing LDAP delete. It prompts us, and it will wait on standard. In fact, we need to kill this because we didn't include -C. Re-authenticate, and it waits for us on standard in. Then let's get the list of objects that are to be removed. Return to the shell and paste them. So one at a time, the LDAP delete utility cycles through the items we specified on standard in. It was unable to find Linux CBTs 1 through 4. However, it did match the sales OU, and after pressing enter, it reflects the fact that it deleted it. Control D sends the final signal to the LDAP delete program indicating that we're done on standard in. And an echo of the exit status should return 32, or it returns an error because of all the errors encountered. However, if we re-execute LDAP search, which searches the directory, scroll to the top where the top-level objects, the organizational units, are indicated before the sub-objects, we'll see that sales no longer exists. So people and engineering are the lone organizational units, and the graphical browser will reflect that reality. So we now only have people and engineering. So there are ways to bypass or work around the errors. They're built into the LDAP utilities. Just use the continuous mode -C, lower C, to bypass any encountered errors. And if you turn on verbosity, you'll see the errors dumped to the screen. And if you send the errors using error redirection to a text file for a large-scale operation, you'll see all of the encountered troubles and be able to rectify them accordingly. Now that, of course, handles removal of items via standard in, but our next task, which is no big difference, is to delete wholesale using a file. So this time, delete remaining OUs and objects via file. And before doing so, what we'll attempt to do, just to show you the nature of LDAP, is to remove a top-level container that is not empty, such as the remaining or surviving organizational units, people in engineering. For example, we'll try to delete engineering and sales, and people, that is, without first deleting the items contained within. So let's set up our command. We're going to execute LDAP delete, but this time specifying a file. And the file will be something that we create. We'll just call it delete remaining items .ldiff. This will be the name of our file, and it will be an extension of what we supply to standard in. We need to update sales, OU equals sales, to be OU equals people. So let's Control R and set OU equals sales, and we want to replace, not just search for, so let's do a replace to update OU equals sales to OU equals people. That's our first batch, and then we should also repeat this in a separate window to reflect engineering. So let's try Control R again, and that'll be OU equals people will become OU equals engineering. Then we'll take these changes and move them back over to the main document that we'll save. So this will delete all of the items, but before we delete them, let's save the file and then try what we told you we would attempt, which is to delete a top-level container without first removing the objects contained within. And for obvious reasons, you should be able to infer that it will not be possible. Let's save this document as delete remaining items .ldiff, and then we'll attempt to delete the top level container. So let's make this step 2. Step 1 will be, or step A will be LDAP delete, and we'll just do this one from the command line as a one-off. The appropriate cn or root dn. And in between double quotes, OU equals people, DC equals Linux CBT. This is the distinguished name of the organizational unit. Let's try to delete this object. We're prompted, and we again neglected the -x option to ignore SASL. We'll tack that on, and notice the error: operation not allowed on non-leaf. Subordinate objects must be deleted first. So, and we should confirm that the objects have not been, or the object has not been removed. We'll scroll towards the top where the OUs are defined beneath the base DN, where we see that people remains. So, back to deleting the items wholesale. That's step B. Let's clear the screen and try to remove the items wholesale. And this will go through and try to remove the items. And let's just update quickly our -x on the recent command line so that we don't run into trouble with the SASL. Now, here's the dump. Here are the entries that were deleted. And we can confirm the output using LDAP search. And let's take a look. Let's see what we indeed updated. And the host is Linux CBT SUSE 2. And let's take a look at our dump here. The LDAP search Linux CBT SUSE 2. So let's see what exists, what was actually deleted. An error was encountered along the way. So people in engineering still exist. However, the users that exist belong to, in this case, one belongs to people, the other belongs to engineering. So at the point where the error occurred is where the failure to delete those two users existed. So let's just look at the dump again. 1 through 4 were deleted from people. Then there was an attempt to delete the organizational unit, but there was still a sub-object. So we need to check our file. We didn't indicate the user 5, and that explains why. So let's indicate 5. There are 5 users, not 4. And ditto for here. And although the bulk of these users do not exist, we'll turn on the C option, which will continue in spite of errors. Let's find it in our history. And finally it deleted it. It ran into errors. So we experience a problem because we attempted to delete a top-level container without first removing subordinate objects. The subordinate objects being Linux CBT 5, the two users Linux CBT 5. Let's search the DIT again, and now it's clean. We have only a base DN. So we've cleaned up our delete remaining objects, and now we're back in business. So this should give you a little sense for how to use the LDAP delete command to remove objects. Again, just to recap, we use the utility by indicating the distinguished name or names of the objects that we'd like to remove. To determine the distinguished names, simply use LDAP search to search for all objects in your tree, or use a graphical browser such as LDAP browser and examine the item. For example, the base DN's distinguished name is DC equals Linux CBT, DC equals internal. When we had other objects, they had distinguished names. So they stand out. That's what's referenced. And if the bulk of the DN is identical, such as all objects contained within a given OU, then you can variabilize the removal, addition, modification of the remaining objects. It's hopefully straightforward. So that's LDAP delete. Now next we want to look at the tool that performs both deletions and additions and modifications. We mentioned if we do a which LDAP add, we see that it's located in user bin. LDAP add is one of the utilities included with the OpenLDAP clients package. It is also linked, in this case symbolically linked, to LDAP modify. When LDAP add is called, it's simply an invocation of LDAP modify with the add option enabled, or the -a option enabled. Let's just note that, which means you can do everything using LDAP modify, but it's still good to know that you have add as well as delete. So note, and we'll note this in the LDAP add section. Let's scroll up. It's a symlink to LDAP modify -a. That should do the trick, which basically means run LDAP modify, but in add mode. And delete works similarly. It's in delete mode. Let's do a which LDAP delete. It too is in user bin. That should come as no surprise. And let's find it in our path to see how it's linked. And we see that it's not linked, that in fact, unlike LDAP add, it's a standalone binary. So LDAP add is linked to modify, LDAP delete is not. And if we lsl user bin LDAP star, we'll see what exactly is linked. Add to modify, modify, which is basically what I add links to, and the rest are distinct. So those are your key utilities. That's how you use LDAP delete. You basically specify the distinguish name either between quotes on the command line, via file using -f, or via standard in. Standard in and a file both allow you to indicate more than one item easily, simply separating them by a new line character. So you can delete wholesale by specifying as we've done here, but be sure that before deleting top level containers you've removed the subordinate objects, otherwise LDAP delete will throw an error. And if you turn on the verbose option, that helps you a lot as well, because it reveals exactly what LDAP is doing along the way. So let's just, the LDAP clients that is, note, use -v to enable LDAP star commands in verbose mode. This way we get a sense for what's happening on the screen. Now there's a whole logging section that we will cover momentarily so that we can trap the actions being performed by slapd, slurpd, and so on to help us debug. But nonetheless, the -v option gives us a little bit of debugging on the command line to give us a sense for what was successful and what failed. Now next, we're going to look at combining these activities, adding, modification, and so on, deleting using the LDAP modify command, which will be your single command to manipulate entries in the directory information tree.